Right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. My name's Emma Jones, and I'm the mum of Ruby Fuller, in whose memory we're running this event this evening. A huge thank you to everyone for coming out this evening and joining us. I just wanted to say a couple of words about the charity that we're doing this for, and just to explain why we're doing it before I hand over to our speaker for the evening. So our daughter Ruby very sadly died of blood cancer last year, and she asked to be remembered by the motto, "Live kindly, live loudly." And she also asked us to raise funds for cancer research in her memory. She died of blood cancer, and that still is a cancer that kills around 200 young people every year. So more research is needed to find better cures for that type of cancer. Now, Ruby absolutely loved the London Underground. She was a born and bred Londoner, and she was never happier than debating with you the quickest way to get from A to B. And she was always right. And she actually dreamt, she was rather torn. She was 18 when she died, and she was torn between trying to get an apprenticeship for Transport for London or going and studying something esoteric at university. But I think Transport for London would have won. So we're delighted to be running this event this evening, and we're thrilled to have the Heritage Advisor from Transport for London, Edmund Bird, coming to speak to us this evening. He is going to be telling us about the history of London's transport network and how it's impacted the growth of our city. He's been the Heritage Advisor to Transport for London since 2006, and he's responsible for over 100 listed stations and bridges. So he's got a lot of work cut out for him there. And before he joined Transport for London, he spent 5 years as, he spent longer than that, as Conservation Officer for the London Borough of Lambeth. And he's actually published a 5-volume history of the architecture of Lambeth. So without further ado, I will hand over to Edmund. Before I just check, can everybody at the back hear us okay? Yeah. Fantastic. So over to you, Edmund.
Thank you very much, Emma. Yes, so my job is to look after all our heritage infrastructure, overground, underground, DLR, river services, the Thames Bridges and the highways, and a very large commercial estate as well that we have a lot of shops, offices and residential. So that's my background, and I'm going to talk about how the present network that I help manage has come about since the Roman times. So a brief canter through the first half, and then mainly a focus on the last 200 years of public transport. So just a quick introduction here. All the various modes of transport, most of which are still with us today, slightly different forms sometimes. Top left is the first electric tram in Kingston in 1906. Early motor cars and taxis in the middle, if we're going clockwise. Metropolitan Railway steam locomotive, top right. Hansom cab, we still use the word cab today, even though it's motorised. Horse-drawn tram, a diesel motor bus, and then a poster advertising the underground.
Oh no, it's back.
I hope this works. Yes. Okay. So I've produced this graph with a few key dates in terms of public transport, particularly over the last 200 years, to kind of give a structure to how things have developed and how this has influenced the growth of our capital. So I've chosen the first date of 1829, which was the first regular omnibus service, horse-drawn, obviously, by George Chilibert. I'll talk about all of these in greater detail during the talk. Then the railways arriving in the 1830s, initially as just intercities with no suburban stations. They came later. And then the first trams in the 1870s. Which were then electrified later on in the 1900s. You probably remember our 150th anniversary of the London Underground that we celebrated about 5 years ago. So that's now about 155 years old. Obviously steam at first, electric following later on. 2 world wars and the first deep tube underground. The first ones were very shallow subsurface. When we learned how to bore deep down, the tube really grew very quickly indeed. And then the population, you can see the correlation between the various transport developments and population rising very, very steeply right up to the Second World War. And then it tailed off until the 1980s, reaching the low point in the sort of late 70s, early 80s, and then rising for the last 35 years or so, hugely. Of course, it tailed off in the last 2 years. For the first time in about 40 years, the population's gone down again during the exodus during COVID and returning people from the continent. Okay, and then also London Bridge is a very good indicator of the kind of changing nature of our infrastructure. There's a model of the Roman bridge on the left-hand side through Tudor times, the Georgian Bridge, and then the bridge built in the early 1970s. I'll talk about that in detail later. Okay, so there's London's growth over the last 200 years. On the left-hand side, showing the 18th century, very, very compact city. Still, even by 1830, the suburbs marching out to what I suppose we'd call now Zone 1 to Zone 2, and then the real growth as soon as the public transport infrastructure started developing to the present day. Two contrasts, you'll recognise the College Road, the toll gate in Dulwich on the left-hand side, very, very sleepy, very rural, hasn't changed that much apart from the traffic. And then the real hurly-burly of the Royal Exchange and Bank, bottom right, in the centre of town. Okay, so start, as I said, with a short, précis summary from the very earliest times. So again, very, very compact city to start with in the Roman times. You can see the Romans built London Bridge in the top right picture. And then the temples, the bathhouses, the villas, and the kind of grid, almost American style actually, grid. Can you all see, by the way, in here? Yeah, good. And very, very tight knit, you can see left-hand side. Saxon, Norman and Roman London for 1,000 years after the Romans. Obviously quite a decline. London Bridge, as you probably know, disintegrated, and the Saxons and Normans didn't really have the Saxons didn't have enough to rebuild it, so we went back to the ferries and the waterborne transport that you can see in the top one there. Basically based on the City of London, the square mile. You can see St Paul's there, and the ancient wall. Many parts still exist today. Some development on the south bank, but only linked by ferries, so it didn't really develop very much. Moving forward, you can check out the population doubling in or quadrupling in 200 years. These are images of London Bridge on the top right, and the growth as the cities of Westminster on the left-hand side gradually merged with the City of London. But again, London based totally on the pedestrian and horse-drawn carts, wagons, etc. Tower of London, obviously, with us today. The Georgian and Regency period, very, very interesting period. The great bridges started to be built. We had London Bridge only for all that time. And then in 1750 is the key date when the second bridge was built, which is Westminster Bridge, not the bridge that's currently there now, but a predecessor. So that really opened up particularly the north of Lambeth and down into to Southwark as well. Very early railways arrived at the end of the Georgian period. In 1837, we've got the first railway embankment through Bermondsey from London Bridge to Deptford and extended a couple of years later to Greenwich. Still very, very horse-based and pedestrian-based, but the early infrastructure of the railways and bus transport. So this is London 10 years or so before Queen Victoria ascended the throne. Got half a dozen or more bridges linking the South Bank, so very, very strong growth through Lambeth and Southwark through to Borough and Kennington, Bermondsey and Rotherhithe. And following the arterial roads, quite interestingly, these days we call it ribbon development, where developers would just develop on the main roads and just leave the backlands free for farms. So beautiful Georgian villas marching down the various arterial roads into London. You can see the royal parks that were established then, later became public parks, Regent's Park, Hyde Park, St James's and Green Park. And the very early docks coming in on the east side as well, obviously. So just the locality, This is a map again at the very early part of the Victorian period. Does this have a pointer? No. Sure it does. I don't think I dare press any other buttons. But you can see Herne Hill start without the E on the top right-hand side, and even Redcoast Hill named there. So all the main routes were there already. Norwood Road, Herne Hill, Denmark Hill, Camberwell Road, Brixton Road, Tulse Hill, Streatham High Road, etc. And long, straggly villas of very well-to-do folk. They were called in those days carriage folk, people that could afford carriages. Probably merchants and businessmen in the city or the West End who took their carriage in every day. A number of big parks and commons, open commons obviously to all, others like Brockwell Hall, private grounds to mansions that were later thrown open to the public. And you've got the great commons of Streatham, Clapham, etc. And then a slightly denser development further north. And that's on the eve of the arrival of the railways, and still largely farmed in between. Nice pictures on the left-hand side. That's taken, you just see the Brockwell Park Lodge on the left-hand side of the top one, which is still there on Norwood Road, and then the grand villas marching up Herne Hill itself, and that's Norwood Road. And then that's the top of Brixton Hill, windmill and streams and farms, very, very rural. That's only less than 200 years ago. Okay, so things really begin to hot up on the transport front in terms of Victorian London. Queen Victoria came to the throne in 1837 and died in 1901, and the population trebled in just 50 years, so extraordinary rapid growth. A lot of slum housing was built that has since been removed. Pictures here, the opening of Tower Bridge in 1894, great ceremonies for that. This is Cannon Street, the old train shed that was demolished in about 1958. The two towers have survived, serving the Southeastern Railway out to Kent and the southeastern suburbs. The Prince of Wales opening the what we now call the Northern Line, the South London Railway to Stockwell and Clapham. Piccadilly Circus, before it was rebuilt in the Edwardian times, showing pretty sparse traffic. And then the first Central London Railway, now the Central Line, which was driven by very large engines, you can see there. And that was the first electric train. So we'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, so moving into the early years of Victoria's reign, congestion was becoming a major problem on the transport front. All the railways were beginning to site their main termini all around the central district. This is London Bridge on the bottom, totally unrecognisable from today, with a rather nice Italian tower there, Campanale. And Euston, sadly destroyed in the early 1960s. That's the Doric Arch, Euston Arch, rebuilt in the 1960s. Various schemes were developed to try and reduce the congestion. Quite an interesting one, bottom right, was an elevated railway built on kind of cast iron verandas at first floor level, so raising everything from the street, and passengers having to walk up to the first floor platforms. Now those were built in some cities, Liverpool, Chicago in America, to name two. The Liverpool one disappeared in the 1950s. Chicago, I think, is still running, going strong. But that never came about. That was going to be Regent Street, so an interesting solution. Trying to address the extraordinary congestion. So there's nothing new today. So London's growth up to the First World War. You can see the various stages. You probably can't see the dates here, but they're approximately every 20 or 30 years of the City of London and Westminster, then moving out to what's now Camberwell, Camden, Bayswater, Paddington, etc. But you can also see the urban growth following the railways that were developed mostly from the 1830s to the 1870s. So kind of fingers of development right up Lee Valley and south to Croydon, east to Woolwich and out to Richmond. Baker Street Station, you'll recognise, very, very similar today, the second picture there. Very early tram on rails, but with horses. That's passing St Mark's Church, Kennington Oval, which is still with us. Still bus routes, and an early electric tram here. There was a great encouragement for people to move out of the inner areas to the more salubrious suburbs. So the railway companies spearheaded that with rather wonderful posters. That's encouraging people to move out to the fresh new suburbs of Golders Green on the Northern Line. So the 20th century, very early colour photographs here from the 30s of an underground train, probably Acton Town or somewhere similar, and trams in their last couple of years of operation. That's on Southwark Bridge, number 10. The trams tended to terminate on the edge of central London because the cities of London and Westminster wouldn't let them in. They thought they were a bit common, so they had to terminate on the boundaries of the city and the borough. And certainly weren't allowed wires either. They had to be conduited underground. A lovely photograph from the 30s, I should think, from one of the new tube stations of the Grand Uplighters, which still we still have in places like Clapham Common and the Piccadilly line stations to the north. And the new double-decker motorbuses covered. Motorbuses were open to the elements until the later 1920s, but were covered over and became much more popular. And that's at Marble Arch there. And again, the population marching through the 20th century, rising very steeply in the first half, and then falling back before rising again in the last 30 or 40 years. So I'll now talk individually about different modes of transport. Just a quick summary. I've kind of broken them down into river, road, rail and tube. Again, some marvellous early colour photographs of St Pancras of the steam train. Maybe Piccadilly Circus on the red tube stock that some of you will remember up until about 30 years ago. Trippers on the open top bus going out to Epping Forest or Hampstead Heath. It wasn't just commuting. Leisure travel really took off in the early 20th century. And we'll talk about the bridges, the trams and the trolleybuses in a moment. So we talked about London Bridge briefly, and there's some more photographs of the bridge through time. Extraordinary in the Tudor period when it was piled high with houses, shops, offices, even a chapel. That put an enormous structural burden on the bridge, which then disintegrated. So it was all swept away. First the houses were removed, and then the whole bridge went. And a really beautiful bridge, top at the bottom left, was built in the 1820s by John Rennie. But by the 1960s, especially the increase in motor traffic, they decided to pull that down and build a brand new concrete bridge, which we have today. And then the bridge was disassembled and the stones numbered and rebuilt in Arizona. I don't know if anyone's been there, but I'd love to see it actually. There's a on the right-hand side is the bridge as it is now. I think there's a modern construction underneath, but faced with all the old stones of London Bridge. So I'll whistle through some of our bridges. The bridges are part owned by Transport for London, some by the boroughs. So I look after most of the central London bridges. Some of the outer ones like Richmond and Kingston are run by the individual boroughs. So in terms of the Georgian bridges, we just have two left, Richmond and Kingston, very beautiful stone structures. All the others were replaced gradually over time by the Victorians, or particularly in the interwar period when motor traffic increased so much. So here the top four bridges have all gone, but we've still got the photographs and etchings to remind us. And they're the architects on the right-hand side and their duration before they were redeveloped. You can see the 1860s, the 1880s, a huge number of the old bridges went. So back to a bit of focus on the local area, Lambeth and Southwark. So as I said before, on the left-hand side, this is a map at the end of the Georgian period, beginning of the Victorian, showing the very grand terraces, semi-detached villas, very tall, 4 or 5 stories, coming down Pennington Road, Clapham Road, Brixton Road, etc. Examples of Pennington Road in the top middle there. Most of them are still with us today. Some were cleared, some were bombed, but they're very, very desirable residences today. The Victorians then kind of sanitised a lot of the very rough commons. You can see Kennington Common as was on the left, top left, still with sheep grazing. St Mark's Church still with us today, opposite Oval Tube Station in the background. Victorians were very concerned about these commons being, well, they had very high crime rates, as you can imagine, but they were also used for gathering for political protests, Kennington in particular, the Chartists. So the Victorians enclosed them with posh railings and built very nice refreshment rooms, bandstands, flower beds, etc. So a kind of sanitisation. And then very large institutions moved down to Lambeth and Southwark. Just two examples here. Imperial Court, which is on Kennington Lane, which was the licensed victuallers school, and the Old Vic, which pictured here in the 1920s. So a lot of the theatres moved south of the river where the rules were less strict, and that went back way before the Georgian period. And then quite a lot of working class housing. This is still with us, thankfully. Any of you that know Rupel Street in Waterloo, Whittlesea Street, etc. Very, very tightly packed, high density, 2 or 3 story terraces with shops and pubs. Really incredible survival, really. So moving into the Victorian Edwardian eras, up to the First World War, very, very large building programme as the city expanded dramatically. A huge range of types. You've got the suspension bridge in the middle, which is Hammersmith, which is being renovated at the moment. The Bascule Bridge, the Tower Bridge, the 1890s. Critical that it opened to allow the very heavy shipping to the docks, which are up to London Bridge in the Pool of London, which is why there were no bridges built east of the Thames, because the docks were so busy. We just had tunnels, I'll talk about in a moment. Really beautiful bridges such as Vauxhall and the top right, using new design processes, beautifully decorated with sculptures, which you don't often see unless you're actually in the water. And then really romantic bridges such as Battersea, all lit up at night, the kind of fairy lights, and the Westminster Bridge that replaced the Georgian one. So a very short-lived bridge was Hungerford Bridge, which is now the Golden Jubilee footbridges either side. It was a road bridge, and then the railway bought it up to get into Charing Cross to build the terminus, shut the bridge to pedestrians, and built the railway bridge instead, but reused the piers. So it was a kind of early sustainable recycling of materials, and the chains of the suspension bridge went to Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. So they were sold off to the Bristol Corporation. And that was designed by Brunel, one of our greatest architects and engineers. Hammersmith Bridge, still with us today, on the, Chelsea Bridge, very, very similar design to Hammersmith, replaced in the 30s by this, I think probably our only Art Deco modern bridge. So slightly American style, really beautifully detailed. So all bridges built in the sort of 1880, 1930s period, Westminster Bridge and Lambeth Bridge, top right, totally unrecognisable from Lambeth Bridge today. Some of them were very badly built. This one had enormous structural problems and had to be shut to vehicular traffic in 1910, soldiered on another 20 years pedestrian only. This is all sounding rather like Hammersmith Bridge today, actually. And then rebuilt by the London County Council in the early 30s. Blackfriars Bridge, bottom left, in parallel with the railway bridge. Really beautifully painted. So we mentioned Albert Bridge and Battersea Bridge, very, very similar suspension bridges, again with the toll booths, beautifully lit. The plainest bridge is Wandsworth Bridge, built, finished in the early years of the Second World War, quite a utilitarian structure. Wandsworth Bridge has been replaced as well. Hammersmith Bridge, very, very fanciful, as I said, currently being renovated. And Battersea Bridge was a very rudimentary structure of the 18th century and replaced by Victorians with beautiful gilded work, which again you only really see from the river. Tower Bridge is the real symbol of London, built by Sir John Wolfe Barry, part of the family of Barrys who built Dulwich College, etc., Houses of Parliament. And the architect Horace Jones, who was a city surveyor. Really, really stunning. This replaced a subway which ran, if you look on the right-hand side, a subway was built just 20 years before initially with little wooden cars that you kind of sat in, almost like a fairground ride, and were pulled across underneath the river. That didn't work very well, so it just became a conventional foot tunnel. And then when the Tower Bridge came along, which was free, toll-free, the subway you paid for, all the trade suddenly dropped off and it was shut only 20, 30 years after it was built. Still there, on one side, you've got a rotunda to the old stairs and lift shaft there. That's now used for telecommunications and various utilities. And then the 20th century bridges, interwar period, a lot were rebuilt. Really stunning bridges such as Chiswick, Twickenham, Hampton Court Bridge, bottom right, by Sir Edwin Lutyens, one of the finest architects of that period. And then London Bridge, we mentioned, and Waterloo Bridge. The top right's interesting. That shows the brand new Waterloo Bridge, which was actually finished by female labourers during the Second World War because their men had gone off to fight. And then a temporary bridge was built to take the traffic whilst the bridge was being reconstructed. You could see in the background a metal bridge, a girder bridge, which took the traffic for quite a few years. So moving on to tunnels and ferries, which you can see here. Rotherhithe and Blackwall still serve us today, although the Blackwall has a second bore built in the 1960s. Really interesting, the Thames Tunnel. I don't know how many of you have been to the Brunel Museum opposite, behind Rotherhithe Station. There's a wonderful day trip, really fascinating. And you go down into the rotunda, right into the old tunnels, which we took over. It's now part of the London Overground, but was a foot tunnel. And it's the middle left-hand side, shows the very elegant tunnels designed by Mark Brunel, Isambard's father. And the Woolwich Ferry. There were many, many ferries in London, which gradually went out of service as the bridges were developed. But the Woolwich Ferry, operated by TfL, was instituted by the London County Council, replacing a much, much older ferry. And the foot tunnels, Woolwich and Greenwich, still very much with us today. They were primarily built to serve the dockers working in the docks either side as a kind of commuter route. Docks, canals and river. The canals obviously predated the railways. Bottom picture shows all the canals in London. A lot of those have gone now. The most local example obviously being the Grand Surrey Canal, which went from the Thames all the way through to Camberwell Road, following the course that was later became Burgess Park. And you still see some structures such as the footbridge over the canal. The Regent's Canal survived much better and is in leisure use today. And then the great docks, the structure of the docks, which closed between the 1960s and the 1980s. The last ones closing were the Royals in the right-hand side, which were the most modern docks, replaced by container transport and the big ports such as Tilbury and Southampton, which had far more capacity. So moving on to highways, TfL is the Strategic Highway Authority in London, so we control the red routes and the old London County Council roads. Here's some examples. The Victorians were incredible engineers, so they built road over road bridges, such as the Archway Bridge, still with us there on the right-hand side, and the Holborn Viaduct on the top left side, again still serving London. And also cut through brand new streets. Shaftesbury Avenue is one example. You can just see the plan there of a brand new road cutting through what were mostly slums. It was a way of displacing people. They didn't actually give them homes until later in the process. They just expected them to move to even more overcrowded areas. And probably the engineering triumph of the mid-Victorian period is the Albert and Victoria embankment, which was not only roads, but also the new district railway underground up beneath, and Getty's great sewers as well, so kind of combined utilities. Then the 20th century, the building of arterial roads, bypasses, relief roads started predominantly in the 1920s. So the North Circular, the South Circular goes way back nearly 100 years. And then the enormous projects of the 1950s and 60s, such as the Hyde Park Corner underpass, say, and the Westway, the motorway coming into London and Paddington. Very, very damaging in terms of town planning, urban design and communities, really severing neighbourhoods either side. Trafalgar Square in the middle, which we pedestrianised, gosh, about 20 years ago, that northern end by the gallery, National Gallery. And along these grand new roads, lots of factories and housing, cinemas, shops grew up. Here's just a few examples from the 1930s on the Great West Road and Western Avenue. So you've got the major companies of the era, many still with us today, such as Hoover, Beecham's, Gillette, etc., building really beautiful Art Deco industrial palaces, most of which are still here. Firestone factory, sadly, was demolished in the 80s, the top one, before it could be listed. And they're being repurposed today. Beecham's, for example, is now housing. So public transport in terms of the roads we'll talk about now. Again, some early colour photographs of a tram on the embankment, motor buses lining up in front of Victoria Station, trolleybuses, wheeled buses but still fed with electricity from above, and that's near Finsbury Square. Very early, this was the recreation of George Chilibier's first horse-drawn bus, omnibus from 1829. There was a recreation in 1929 when that photograph was taken. And then the Underground, which we'll talk about in greater detail. So before London Transport was created in 1933, there were a whole myriad of different bus operators, as still happens in some cities such as Manchester. But the London General Omnibus Company gradually bought up most of the bus lines. And this is their map from the eve of the First World War, showing all the routes coming in from the suburbs, including a lot of leisure travel. I think I mentioned earlier, the dotted lines are the kind of weekend and bank holiday special buses out to the public open spaces, such as Bushy Park in the left in Surrey, and Epping Forest, and the Northern Heights in North Finchley. And here are some of the buses, rapid development. This is pre-First World War motor buses, and then by the 1930s, you've got buses that are pretty close to the ones we have today with enclosed top decks. This is the tram network at its very height, at its zenith in the early 1930s, showing a very, very dense network, particularly in north and south, less so on the western side, and in East London, the East End served with trams going all the way up to Croydon and up to the northern suburbs. In 1931, the decision was taken to replace trams with trolleybuses, which, as I said, are the rubber-wheeled vehicles with catenary. And so by the Second World War, all the trams had gone virtually from the north of the Thames, and then the southern conversion was postponed by the war. And by that time, they changed their mind again and decided to cease electric power for buses and go for the smelly diesels, which I think now we see as a retrograde step. So some local trams here. Norwood Road, this is just before Brockwell Park, with the old electric trams, probably in the Edwardian period, leading up to West Norwood. Brixton Town Centre with the very Art Deco sort of streamlined tram, the Felton tram, top right, and a motor bus that would replace the trams in 1952, and then going back in time even more, a horse-drawn tram, again on Norwood Road. There was a tram route through Herne Hill, down Milkwood Road, Dulwich Road, joining to go down Norwood Road to West Norwood. And going through some very tiny streets around Poplar Walk as well. So this is the trolleybus and tram network. You can see the trolleybuses replacing all the trams in the north. The dashed lines were the trams that were just about to be removed, running through our two boroughs. Rather nice. The trolleybuses, there was one route that came close to us, to the Crystal Palace terminus, which went down Anerley Hill. You can just see the Crystal Palace transmitter in the background, looping off to Sutton. They were very, very efficient, very smooth riding, very comfortable and very, very quick, and obviously pollution-free at street level. Obviously they're powered by power stations. So on to the railways. Here's a kind of tableau of mainline termini in London. As I said, all not coming right into the middle of London, but ending in a kind of ring round the north, east, west, and south. I'm sure you recognise most of them. Broad Street, you won't do, that was demolished in the 1980s, which served the North London, and the Cannon Street train shed there. Liverpool Street largely surviving, despite some redevelopment in the 1990s. St Pancras very much still with us, now the High Speed 1 and Eurostar terminus. And Victoria with a hotel. A lot of them had very big railway hotels, some of which survive today. So that was the railways in 1850, about 10 years after the first railway. As I said earlier, mainline only. They didn't really think about suburban traffic particularly. They were just to get you from London to Bristol or London to Brighton or Southampton. So you've got the main lines all present, except for the more recent lines into Marylebone and Victoria. And then the companies in the 1860s and the 1870s recognised the value of the suburban market, such as Herne Hill. We're standing here in the 1862 station, built on the main line that just went straight through before. Pictured here is the Nine Elms terminal, which was the main terminus for the Southampton line until Waterloo was built, which then became a goods depot, and that was demolished in the 1960s. It was approximately where the US Embassy and our Nine Elms tube station now is, and then King's Cross, top right. So getting back to the local level, showing the impact of the railways on Herne Hill. Top left from the Lambeth Archives is a image of the very grand villas that lined Herne Hill itself and down through Denmark Hill. They were all swept away. There was a kind of upper middle class flight. As soon as railways came and builders started gradually developing smaller houses, the wealthy upsticked and moved to places like Beckenham, Bromley, etc. Maybe a bit like happening now, lots of people moving out to country areas. So you can see in the maps of the 1890s and the 1930s, what we call now a densification of mostly terraced housing and semi-detached houses. Poets' Corner being the earliest, north of Brockwell Park. That followed very soon after the railway. And then in the 20s and 30s, lots of infilling, especially between Herne Hill and Dulwich, when the last of the fields went. Brockwell Park, I've already mentioned, thrown open to the public in the 1890s. And a nice photograph here of Herne Hill Station Square in the 1920s, I would say. Very little change really in terms of the actual buildings. So Herne Hill is a real classic late Victorian Edwardian suburb. Just a quick summary of some of the finest landmarks that really all developed in response to the railway. If the railway hadn't have come, Herne Hill certainly wouldn't have developed in the way it did and so quickly. So developing into a really strong village centre with parades of the 1900s along Half Moon Lane, top left, an aerial view of Poets' Corner in the top right, the Peabody on Rosendale Road, philanthropic houses and flats, and then civic buildings such as the Carnegie Library, the old fire station, which is now Sainsbury, which only was a horse-drawn fire station for a while. And then into the interwar years, we've got wonderful landmarks such as Dorchester Court, the Lido, and bottom left, a Suntrap House, which Lambeth, following pressure from the Herne Hill Society this week, have issued a building preservation notice to protect it from demolition. So we're hoping that might be listed. That's on the Lambeth side of Herne Hill. So there was a great electrification programme in the 1920s and 30s. Total electrification for south of the Thames in terms of the suburbs. The north, east and west were much, much slower. The estate agents very quick to jump on the bandwagon of new electric services. This is an advert for the Southern Railway in the middle, which served here. And the Amersham, very similar half-timbered, semi-detached or terraced, some larger detached houses as well. So interestingly, the class, the social class makeup of London is interesting because it depended partly on the individual railway companies. Some companies, such as the Great Eastern, offered very, very cheap workmen's fares, and they were approximately a third of the price of fares of, say, from Herne Hill. Very, very dense working class housing developed around those railways, whereas railways that had a higher charge, such as around here, maybe into the west, had more middle class housing. So kind of supply and demand. So beautiful old posters here from the Great Eastern and the Metropolitan Railway, extolling people to move out to the suburbs, because the new electric services, particularly, the commute was pretty much the same as, say, from Camberwell to London, if you walked or took a slow bus, as it was way out to Beckenham or Streatham. The railways have played a really important part in feeding and building our city. Obviously, bringing in foodstuffs from the fishing ports, such as Hull, Lowestoft, Fleetwood, etc. Same day transport of arable milk being really critical, coming into vast goods depots that were built, such as Bishopsgate or Nine Elms or St Pancras. And then all the building materials. You can see a housing estate under construction in probably the 1920s there, from the brick fields of Bedfordshire, the steel mills, the slate quarries, mines, etc. So really, really important in supporting the growth of the city, not just for commuting and travel. Transport has been a very important catalyst for social change in the city, going way back. Let's go clockwise. Top left, I think I showed you before, the Mayor of Kingston, very proudly in the first electric tram. Just behind him, supervising him, is one of the first mixed race tram drivers who we discovered quite recently was on our payroll, who later became an Olympic athlete as well. He's just standing next to the Mayor there. We had a big campaign in the 1950s. We had a severe labour shortage, so we canvassed, we recruited in places like the West Indies, bringing a lot of people over to work on the buses and the trains, as well as things like National Health Service. So from the 1950s, we had a very multiracial staff. In terms of women, in the First and Second World War, again, severe labour shortage, the men went off to fight. So we were one of the first to employ women in a whole range of roles. London's got used to seeing women station porters, station clerks, conductresses for the first time. And the Second World War, that developed even more with repairs in some of our maintenance depots. Women stepped in there. Much earlier, the railways and the canals before were built by large armies of navvies, many of whom came over from Ireland. Some went back, many settled here. And this is an example of the Metropolitan Railway being built by navvies under the Euston Road. And then in terms of women later on, we became one of the first transport authorities to employ women tube drivers and bus drivers, but not until the mid-1970s, which some might seem quite late. So this is transport enabling the vast public estates that the London County Council and then the GLC after them built. And this is a plan from the late 1930s, showing the biggest council estate in Europe, Becontree, on the right-hand side, being built out in Dagenham, and a lot of the estates on the borders of Lambeth and Croydon and Merton on the southern ring, such as Downham, Bellingham, etc., St Helier. And then in the middle, the trams and the buses supporting very large schemes of block dwellings, as they're called. Bottom left, you can see some very typical London County Council flats, very high density, built in the 1930s, and the two trams on the Brixton route just in front of them. That's at the Oval. So we'll canter through, how we're doing for time, right? Do a quick canter here through some underground history as well. Our first underground railway from Farringdon Street to Paddington, which is now the Circle District Met Hammersmith and City, line. Constructed in the 1860s, cut and cover, so not bored through the ground, but literally the road lifted off, the rail lines going in and then covered over it again. Steam driven, so very, very dirty. You can see bottom left on our 150 years, we ran a steam train service along the Metropolitan line through Baker Street. So that really inhibited the having deep tube, because the steam trains had to wait until electricity came along. Also to power lifts and escalators, because you couldn't get the people down there even if you wanted to. So this is the gradual spread of the Metropolitan Railway out to Hammersmith, South Kensington. Beautiful stations, most of them still with us, such as Gloucester Road there and Notting Hill Gate. An extraordinary station at Blackfriars here with the Byzantine style, almost sort of Turkish style domes, sadly bombed in the Second World War. Almost the complete circle line you can just see there from Moorgate to Mansion House, just waiting for the final bit through Tower Hill on the right-hand side. Promoted very vigorously by adverts emphasising speed, comfort, dry, clean travel for commuters. The Metropolitan Railway lasted up until London Transport was created in 1933, had a very, very dense network stretching way out into Buckinghamshire, well beyond Aylesbury. Posters, again, they were also estate developers, so they actually developed houses around their stations for commuters, which is now called Metroland. Building really stunning stations, Baker Street. They had an inner city design for places like Great Portland Street of white faience, and a kind of cottagey villa style for the suburbs, matching some of the arts and crafts cottage architecture of the housing around. So the first deep tube in 1890 sit in South London Railway. Kennington Station is the only one left still with us, with the original St Paul style dome, which housed all the lifts, which took you down to the platform level, still does today. Most of those were replaced in the 1930s by escalators, which were much more efficient, moved passengers much more quickly and easily. So stations like, I think that is Stockwell Oval on the middle there, were demolished in the 30s. And this shows the underground network in the 1910s, with the Northern Line coming down through Clapham, terminating at Clapham Common. Initially, the rolling stock, people, they presumed people wouldn't want to look out because it was all underground. They became known as the padded cells. So they just had tiny high-level split windows, which passengers hated, so they had to go back to the drawing board. Clapham is a good example of a neighbourhood which grew very, very rapidly following the Clapham Omnibus, famous Clapham Omnibus, and then the tube in the 1890s. So a lot of later Victorian Edwardian buildings shown here, filling in all the gaps around the common. Most of the Georgian houses survived. Victorians simply built behind them. Then the second deep tube was a central line, then called the Central London Railway. You can see much more comfortable stop. The Americans financed a lot of our early railways, tube railways. Yerkes came over from Chicago to run some of them. So the style of the rolling stock is very, very American. And even things like we call underground cars, which is an American term, which isn't used anywhere else in Britain. And some of our signalling has signal cabin, for example, which again is American. Signal box everywhere else outside London. Early locomotives, huge great things, were very quickly replaced by the kind of multiple units we have today. Even then, it was seen as a kind of a key unlocking regeneration, new housing, new employment opportunities from the outer suburbs into town. So the new tube lines had a massive impact in terms of the economic base of the city. The West End grew very, very rapidly. Enormous department stores, such as Liberty's shown here, Selfridges at the top. Giant offices in the City of London replacing much smaller ones as commuters poured in, shoppers, shop workers from all over Greater London and beyond. This is Charles Tyson Yerkes, the very American roll-top desk, who masterminded the Bakerloo and the Piccadilly lines, amongst others. Classic oxblood faience stations, most of them have survived. This one at York Road has been disused for 90 years, but it's still standing just north of King's Cross. Some of them were closed to accelerate services when the lines were extended into the suburbs. Interesting designs with the beautiful tiles, the canthus green tiles here, pomegranate elsewhere, and also the interior of stations. This is Piccadilly Circus. There were different tile designs for different stations, partly to help a very illiterate population in the early days. Lots of people couldn't read the station sign, but they could recognize the colors of the tiles. So that was a kind of early sort of identification. And then there was a a huge boom in tube lines just before the First World War. Lines we now know of the Northern Line. The Bakerloo was the Baker Street and Waterloo Railway, and very soon passengers condensed that to Bakerloo. It wasn't a corporate decision, and persuaded the railway company to use that term. It's going to be very interesting when the Elizabeth line opens, hopefully in the next few months, if that will be abbreviated or given a more familiar term. Slight mouthful at the moment, Betty line or something maybe. And there's a route plan of the Bakerloo, serving a lot of leisure places such as London Zoo. Moving into the 20th century, this is the same architect designing very, very different styles, from the Edwardian oxblood faience through to very classical style for Brent Cross, and then very, very modernist, very continental inspired. I think that's Osterley in the bottom right, and Boston Manor in the middle. Lots of advertising, telling people to move to burbs. This is our Northern Line going through Clapham. This shows the kind of regenerative effect. The station was built, and then in fields, and then within a few years, all the residential cul-de-sacs and avenues very, very swiftly followed, developing the area. Lord Ashfield is the chairman of London Transport, opening the Northern Line with his daughter. And then very, very clever advertising, meeting London's needs, etc. A lot of reconstructions in central London to cope with the vast increase in passenger numbers. Piccadilly Circus is still very much in its late 1920s form today, protected by a Grade 2 listing. Extraordinarily complex station, as the left-hand diagram shows, with the Piccadilly and the Bakerloo lines on various levels linked by escalators and stairways. Escalators first introduced in 1912. I think Earl's Court was the first one, and really kind of sped up the process of waiting for lifts, etc. Very, very Art Deco in style. More Art Deco or modern stations on the Piccadilly, out in up towards Cockfosters and down to Hounslow West. Again, lots of virgin territory, green fields are rapidly developed near the interchanges. The stations were designed to interchange with trams, trolleybuses, buses, etc. So very advanced for their time. This shows a new works programme of 1935. Lots of lines that were never built, actually. We've got the extension of the tube network over the old steam branch lines, such as Epping Longer, Hainault, West Ruislip, taking over steam lines going into mainline termini. And then in the north here, extensions into the Green Belt, up to Bushy and Elstree and Denham, which were never built because the Green Belt came along after the Second World War, and the areas were protected, and there's no need to extend the tube. And an extension down to Camberwell, you can see here too. It was also mooted in the 1940s, and sadly there was never enough money. They did start lots of trial holes on Camberwell Green, but hopefully in time the Bakerloo line will be extended, but this time via the Old Kent Road and Peckham to Lewisham. So here's some examples of late 1930s and some early female staff in the 1930s. Really beautiful architecture and design with stained glass and picture windows. 1940s stations, slightly more austere, but beautifully crafted. White City, Newbury Park as an interchange with buses, and West Acton. And then coming closer to present times, there were very few lines built in the 50s and 60s. Central government money was mainly diverted into building the new motorways and road construction, and some investment in the main line electrification, such as the West Coast Main Line and lines to Kent and Bournemouth. But in the early 60s, we got going again and opened the Victoria line in 2 stages, in 1968 to Walthamstow to Victoria, then the extension a couple of years later down to Brixton. Pimlico was an afterthought. That wasn't planned initially, and then I think the Tate Gallery lobbied London Transport to provide a station there. So that was going to spark all kinds of regeneration in Brixton. Top left is a model produced by Lambeth Council planners in the 60s to lay waste to most of Brixton town centre and build high-rise flats and shopping centres. I think about the only thing to be built was the Brixton Recreation Centre in the bottom there, with International House behind. That's the Queen opening the Victoria line in 68. Then into the 70s, we became the first city to have an underground service to an international airport. Heathrow opening in the mid-1970s. And then the Jubilee line, the first phase, Stanmore to Charing Cross in 1979. The Charing Cross bit was abandoned 20 years later when the Jubilee was extended out to Docklands. And there still is a disused station at Charing Cross, kind of mothballed for the last 20, 30 years. Leading artists of the day to decorate the stations, such as Edoardo Palazzi, the Italian-Scottish architect who designed the amazing embellishments at Tottenham Court Road. And then the Jubilee line extension, again, we commissioned the best architects of the day 20, 25 years ago to design the stations on the line out to Stratford through Canary Wharf. And just like the Victorians, it was a regenerative effect. Docklands was extremely depressed. As soon as we got the Jubilee line running and the DLR, it spawned a huge building boom. So it's kind of transport leading the way, really. DLR, just mentioned, built in the 80s and 90s and noughties. Still a lot of derelict land. This is a recent photograph of Millennium Mills and the Royal Docks, but it really did provide the catalyst of all the development around Canary Wharf, and then extended later down to Lewisham and Woolwich, and we can all see what's happening to Lewisham, the high-rise development. Right up to the present day, we've got our Northern Line extension that I worked on with new stations at Nine Elms and Battersea Power Station. There's a high-level pool that's been in the news a lot close to Nine Elms Station. And coming very soon is the Elizabeth Line. I think I've had this slide for other lectures for about the last 3 years. But hopefully we'll be here in the spring. Whitechapel, top left, rebuilt station there behind the original facade. New rolling stock, which maybe some of you have ridden on already, to Heathrow. That's at Paddington. And then the glimpses of the two new stations there, which are being handed over as we speak. And then just a quick flashback in time. Obviously, I'm the conservation officer for TfL, so I have the privilege really of working on lots of restoration schemes. And here's some example of Victorian, Edwardian interwar heritage, still serving its true purpose today. And we've just renovated these various schemes and won rather nice awards for our restorations at Hanwell, which is on the new Elizabeth line. So my dog Rupert, top left, and a new public square we worked on with Ealing, which replaced a car park, and hopefully will be tenanted soon the Victoria Station Arcade, which runs through from Victoria Street to the mainline terminus, which we've just ripped out all the old plastic and aluminium shop fronts from the 1970s and 80s, really tacky, and put back exact replicas of the Edwardian shop fronts with the Edwardian colour scheme and Edwardian style lighting. And then we're doing a huge programme of step-free access. Herne Hill's already benefited by the South Eastern's project. But we're doing the same on the Tube. And here's a classic 1930s station, Sudbury Hill in the northwest, where we've put new lift towers exactly matching the original Charles Holden building there. Right, I've hardly got any voice left. I think most of you have got these books already, but Lambeth commissioned me about 15 years ago to write an architectural history of the borough, and I've donated quite a few copies. So all proceeds for any of the books I've written will go to the Ruby Funds. I'm very happy to sign them as well as the author, if you like. But that's an architectural history from Victoria's reign up to the turn of the century. Thank you very much indeed.
If you could only save one London Underground station in its current form, which would you choose? Gosh,
only one? Rather not. I think it would be probably one of Charles Holden's 1930s classics on the Piccadilly line, because they are so beautifully detailed and so space age. Southgate, I think I'll go for. And I think I did had a picture of there, which looks like a huge UFO.
And any other questions? We've got any from online? Yes, let's go to online. Oh, go here.
This is a personal question. There's a rumour that there's going to be a station on Surrey Canal Road. There is what looks like the bones of the station, but there's no line. Can you give us any
There's no.
There's no train.
Yes.
There's no stop. It looks like a stop.
Yes, yeah, that's quite right. It's the London Overground. It's between Surrey Quays and Queen's Road, Peckham. And we've made what we call passive provision, which means you kind of lay out the lands which could take a station quite easily. And there's a plan to build, I think they're going to call it Surrey Canal Road Station. Sometimes it's been called New Bermondsey, to serve all the new residential areas around Old Kent Road and Surrey Canal Road. So I think that's a medium-term project, but that's certainly going to the planning stage quite soon. Yeah.
It's not just a
There used to be an old station on Old Kent Road that shut in the First World War, very close to that, which shut because the trams took away all their trade. So yeah, hopefully that will go in the next 10 years.
Any other questions?
Normally I get questions like, why was the 37 running late this afternoon? I can't answer ones like that. Yes.
And why was the bridge?
Because we were knocking it down, and an American millionaire, an entrepreneur, was creating a new, I think it was a leisure resort. Do you know American person over here? Do you know? Just walking around. There's lots of rumours they were expecting Tower Bridge, but I think that's a rather nice rumour because they obviously saw photographs of London Bridge. But those rumours are great fun. So they just bought the stonework, lock, stock, and barrel to face a modern bridge to kind of give it a kind of the new resort, a kind of instant historic landmark. So yeah.
Has anyone ever seen it in Arizona?
The Americans pinched a lot of our castles and stately homes that were literally disassembled, numbered all the stones, the wood, and then rebuilt in America, particularly in the 1910s, 1920s.
There are two good questions.
One of the churches too. Yes.
Two questions in the chat.
The transition from tram to trolleybus is like slightly counterintuitive. You hinted that it's due to speed and comfort, but it seemed like a slightly offset.
Yes, it was. It was really in response to motor traffic, motor cars, because the trams were obviously running on fixed rails. One disadvantage is they have to run down the middle of the street. They can't actually discharge passengers on the pavement, otherwise they'd be moving in and out all the time. So there was a road safety problem, and the trolleybuses were looked at, were seen as more versatile, more flexible, because although they were electrically powered, which was wonderful, they could actually manoeuvre. So if a tram, say, broke down, then the whole line just stopped, a bit like a train breaking down, whereas a trolleybus could actually manoeuvre. You could also come into the curb, so you could have traditional bus stops on the pavement rather than having to cross onto a central island. So I think that was the main thing. It was really the rise of motor cars that was the death knell of the tram. But yeah, I mean, most of us see it as a retrograde step. Yes.
If you had to choose, would you say that transport has caused the
Transport has caused
like local growth, population growth, or is it the population growth of
no, mostly the former. Yeah, the transport got there over green fields, and the builders responded by building close by. I'm trying to think of any other example. Well, I suppose the Northern Line is responding to growth. The extension to Battersea, that was that it was designated a major growth zone. So the buildings started going up. The tube line comes to serve new buildings. So it's a bit of both, really. Yeah.
kind of following on from that, I guess it's like the trains often increase growth of urbanisation, so it kind of impact like level
Oh, that's a really good question, because generally they were very positive and it increased the wealth, increased the mobility, but in lots of areas such as Bermondsey or Camden Town, Kentish Town, the coming of the railways destroyed a lot. They were just cut through existing neighbourhoods, and you'll see the railway actually from Herne Hill to Elephant and Castle. You'll see a much older sort of early Victorian, late Georgian places like Sutherland Square, where the railway just scythed its way through, demolished whole sections of terraces, just left a few standing. And lots of those areas then went downhill because they were less attractive. Obviously, the steam rail was very dirty, very noisy. So that was another reason why in Herne Hill, when the railways came, it wasn't just the growth of terraced houses, but they were very, very dirty pieces of infrastructure, and the wealthy weren't prepared to live in that kind of environment, so they moved out to cleaner areas of Kent and Surrey. So yeah, a bit of both again.
I've got a question from.
Can I do one question from online, just to say we've lost video, so anyone online, apologies for kind of done with video. The one question, one interesting question was, how many mothballed stations are there in London?
I'm not going to get my fingers and toes out, but I can just name a few, for example. Yes, we do have quite a few. York Road, I've already mentioned, Down Street, Aldwych, South Kentish Town. Oh, this is like 20 questions, isn't it? Brompton Road. So we've got at least, I'd say, a dozen or so. And they were all mostly inner urban stations. And then when we extended to places like Cockfosters or Hounslow, we needed to speed the service up. So, and they're also very, very closely spaced. Down the street was between Green Park and Hyde Park, which you can walk in 10 minutes, but there was a station in the middle. So we cut out the old stations. Most of them are still there. The surface and the tubes just run through the old platforms. Aldwych was a separate one. That was a branch line that closed in most people's lifetimes here in the mid-1990s, which was a shuttle to Holborn. So that's still there and very popular for filming. So film crews go down there and recreate the London Underground in 1900, 1930, etc. I think Network Rail have got some derelict stations as well. But on the tube, I should think it's probably about 10.
Okay. And then two other more random questions is, where can people buy your books online? Is there a place?
The architectural history books, yes. Herne Hill Society online. Just to.
Well, you know what? They can buy them from us, and we'll post it to them. If we have any left over.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
We'll share a link, and you can email us, and we can make sure.
And every Lambeth library, I think, sells them as
And
well.
then the final question, then we're done online. Can we share that slide deck with the video follow-up? So people are interested in just being able to see the slides we went through.
Share them with whom?
The people.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think it's going to be on YouTube.
Yeah, we'll figure that out.
Put it like
Yeah.
on a PDF or something. Yeah.
We'll figure that out.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
That's fine with me. Yeah.
Yes.
Any other questions from our? We've got a couple more.
3. Well, okay, I'll work my way around.
You might be able to explain this. I seem to remember reading somewhere that there's somewhere, I think it's in Bayswater, Leinster Square or somewhere, where you've got a facade of a house.
Yes.
Could you just explain?
Yes. The Metropolitan Railway cuts through a very well-heeled, very wealthy area, and literally removed houses to build the line, the subterranean line. And the local populace was so cross to see this gap in their square that they funded the creation of just facades. It's almost like a Wild West or a film set facade, matching all the other houses in the road. So yeah, Leeds Square is a very famous. I think there's 1 or 2 other examples too. Yes, I'd love to know.
I've actually been through one of these squares and thought, I never knew that.
Yes.
I walked through it and hadn't realised that it was just dummy facade.
Yes. Also to screen all the smoke, because there were steam trains too, so that went up instead of out into the square. So, somewhere over here, yes.
It's just interesting that like 100 years, the technology really hasn't changed that much. It's kind of recognised in that many decades. When you look to the future, do you see the technology likely to change? I think of Elon Musk and he's building that thing with Dodger Stadium in LA, possibly LA to San Francisco. Do you see any significant
Gosh, you're asking a historian, the conservation officer, who always looks back, not forward. I mean, the first thing would be driverless trains, which we've had on the DLR for 40 years, 30, 40 years. And we've got the ability to have those on the tube. So that is quite a big difference. And certainly in terms of signalling, on most lines, the driver just supervises or opens the doors. It's all computer driven, where the train stops, when it starts, where it stops at signals, etc. I mean, trams have been a recent phenomenon, the resurgence of trams in both America. The continent never got rid of them, so they kept most of theirs. We kept ours in Blackpool, didn't we? So I can certainly see new. In fact, my first job when I joined TfL, my first project was the Cross River Tram, which was from Brixton and Peckham up to Camden through Waterloo and central London. So I can see schemes like that certainly coming back to the drawing board, because trams are so efficient and so much more environmentally friendly and so swifter too. But in terms of technology, I think you'll have to ask someone else.
I think we have one more question over here, and then I think we'll.
Yes.
It's just on the studies of tram. is there an intention at all to extend Croydon tram link?
Yes, there is. I've got certainly colleagues of mine in the office are working on the Saturn Extension. I'm not quite sure where that will go from Wimbledon maybe, but certainly serving Sutton Town Centre, mostly on roads, I think, because most of the Croydon tram system was built on old railways or railways that were converted to trams. So they're very efficient because they don't share traffic with roads.
Can they use a sort of reservation system like you get in places like Amsterdam
and Birmingham as well? Yes, lots of the roads were built. Well, I think we do have some of those. Certainly the 1920s and 30s areas would have had trams on grass reservations. Yes, yeah. Crystal Palace has been mooted. Trams going up from Norwood through up Anley Hill through the park. And Streatham has been looked at as well. So yeah, certainly mostly northward extensions, yeah, quite logical ones.
Thank you so much.